Daytime highs have exceeded 110 degrees for close to a month now. The homeless having a really tough time coping.
Stefan James DeWitt Livingood pours some ice in a cooler inside the shack of scavenged wood and tarps where he lives in Phoenix, Arizona.
Heat bumps everywhere. It gets really hot out here, guys.
It's so hot people are dying from burns sustained by walking, sitting, or falling onto outdoor surfaces. Amanda Wynn is a volunteer with the community group Guarded Hope.
The only way to stay a little bit cool is by having something to keep your food cool, something to keep your water cool.
Maricopa County, Arizona tallied over 24 confirmed heat-related deaths this season and 425 last summer, of whom 40% were unhoused residents. I'm Jennifer King.
Also at srnnews.com, tread carefully Senator Rand Paul's advice to fellow Republicans as they think about impeaching President Biden.
Senator Paul is warning against what he calls the trap of impeachment. He told the Fox Business Network it's not good for the Republic to keep impeaching presidents and indicting presidents. That's after House Speaker Kevin McCarthy this week raised the possibility of impeachment when on Fox News he said the president has engaged in, as he put it, the weaponization of government to benefit his family and deny Congress the ability to have oversight. Bob Agnew reporting.
Although inflation is still running above the Fed's 2% target rate, the rate of increase is slowing. Consumer prices rose 3% last month compared to a year earlier, and consumer spending at the same time remains robust. Stocks trading higher on Wall Street. The Dow is up 187 points. The Nasdaq ahead 214. This is SRN News. A Christian ministry takes on a big bank.
Barclays is one of the largest financial institutions in Britain and the world, and back in 2020, it abruptly closed the account of the International Federation for Therapeutic and Counseling Choice, which opposes the LGBT agenda. Barclays never gave a reason, but recently agreed to pay the ministry $26,000 in compensation. But the account remains closed, and the IFTCC wants it opened. Other Christian groups have also seen their accounts closed. Michael Harrington, SRN News.
Republicans trying to get the votes of a new group this election cycle, Mama Bears. It's a nickname being applied to conservative women who are organizing for parental rights. Donald Trump has praised their work, saying groups such as Moms for Liberty have taught the liberal left that it should not mess with America's moms. Ron DeSantis is also using the term Mama Bears. Many parents' rights groups have sprung up lately. SRN News. Court proceedings in the case of a teen gunman who killed 4 fellow students in a Michigan high school.
The hearing is to determine if now 17-year-old Ethan Crumley gets life in prison or a shorter sentence with parole. Detective Edward Wagowski described video he saw of Crumley shooting student Madison Baldwin.
As he turns to walk away, her body just slumps to the ground.
Lieutenant Timothy Willis says a 22-page journal was found in a bathroom stall, apparently left behind by Crumley before the shooting.
When I shoot up the school, I hope that every parent of kids I gratefully murder will be so sad that they kill themselves.
Crumley's lawyers will argue he should be released at some point because of his untreated mental illness and abhorrent family life. I'm Ed Donahue.
President Biden visits Maine today, signing an executive order encouraging companies to manufacture new inventions in the U.S. More details, srnnews.com.
Our weather forecast from the National Weather Service. Sunny and hot conditions continuing today into the weekend for all of our listening areas. For Provo, Orem, and Utah Valley, the high today near 100 degrees, 69 tonight, 101 tomorrow. 97 your daytime high for Richfield and Sevier Valley today, 66 tonight, 96 on Saturday. For Price and Castle Valley, sunshine 95 today, a few clouds, partly cloudy tonight, 66, and then sunshine again on Saturday, 95. And for Vernal, Roosevelt, and the Uinta Basin, 97 the high today, partly cloudy, 62 tonight, 98 the high on Saturday. Our key verse, Proverbs chapter 16, verse 20. He who gives attention to the word will find good, and blessed is he who trusts in the Lord. Thanks for listening to KEYY Provo, KEYR Richfield, KEYB Price, and KEYB Vernal. Key Radio, Life Unlocked, Truth Unleashed.
from the Key Radio Studios in Provo, Utah, and broadcasting live throughout Utah County, Sevier County, South Central Utah, Carbon County, and the Uinta Basin. It's your good friends Mike and Heather in the morning.
Hey, good morning. This is Mike and Heather in the morning. Mike and Heather aren't here, but I am Grant, and I'm here with Greg at the controls, and I've got second string Mike here with me.
That's right. Fill in
Mike Cunningham. And our guest today is Pastor Nathaniel Wall of Alpine Bible Church in Lehi, Utah.
I like how we started off talking about the Mike and Heather show, but I think when they're gone, we don't have to call it that. Or while they're gone, you just completely rename it. Do whatever you want.
I was thinking about that, but then I would have to redo that intro there, and that was the only barrier for me this morning. I was going to entirely rename the show, but I was like,
there's someone driving who listens probably every day, and they're thinking if you don't identify that it's that, they're going to just change the channel. So. You did the right thing. Who are these people?
You could ask viewer suggestions, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, yeah, we certainly could. But Alpine Bible Church. What's going on over there? What you guys got going on?
Building projects and ministry and the never-ending reach the valley with passion for the Lord.
Yes,
so. It's got a great group of people, healthy, thriving, and just enjoying what the Lord's doing. So,
yeah, I mean that's
what
awesome.
You want, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's like sometimes with church we feel like, oh, we need to be doing things, we need to have programs, we need to have a lot going on, but like at the heart of it, it's just we are the saints, we're the called out ones, and we gather together. And that's the heart of it, is just coming together and worshiping our risen Lord together.
That's it. And this summer, we traditionally usually go through a section of Psalms. So that's what we're doing. Just as people travel and are going around, we find the Psalms have just been a great book. You could just take it a chapter at a time. You don't have to worry about how the chapters connect as much in the book of Psalms. So it's been a good worshipful book for us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also something that's like the Psalms. It's kind of difficult to preach that.
The Psalms?
Yeah, because it's like song lyrics,
Yeah,
it's like there's some great truths in there, but at the same time, it's like it isn't like narrative driven. It isn't like it's not like punchy like with Paul, he's like, do this, do that. This is what a good spiritual life looks like,
I love the book of Psalms just simply because most of the Bible is God's talking to us. Mm-hmm. Psalms is man responding back to God, and it teaches us how to worship in adversity in a lot of cases. I mean, there's more to the Psalms than that, but there's a lot of lamenting in the Psalms.
It's very emotional, and there are a lot of people just we don't know how to deal with our emotions, and. We're told, hey, just suck it up. Yep. Just sweep that under the rug. Don't talk about it. And here are the psalmists, particularly David, who just kind of lays it all out there and isn't afraid to tell God, I'm not doing so great.
Right.
And I think it's really good to be reminded of that. It's good to feel those things, and it's okay. And what's most important is taking that to God. Yeah. God isn't surprised when we're having a bad day. He knows, and so it's good to pray that. Good
and
to
our
take
problems
that to God.
Are not too big for Him.
Absolutely, yeah.
I was going to make a joke, but you're right. It's probably not a good part to joke in. Yes, our problems are not too big. I think oftentimes that is the problem, is we start to look too much at ourselves and not enough of Him. Our view of ourselves is too high, and our view of God's too low. And Psalms teaches us to reverse that. Right?
That's awesome.
Yeah, and that's something we've been looking at in the book of Mark. Mark really highlights the authority of Jesus, that Jesus is God, and He has authority over all these different things. He had authority over let's see. He had authority over the man who was crippled. He had authority over. Oh gosh, help me remember, Mike. What have we been looking at? What else?
Oh goodness, Mark 1 flies
over?
in the face. It starts with John the Baptist and announcing him, and it's right into calling disciples and his baptism and temptation and ministry, and the pacing is so.
It's a book of action.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It's so usually you have the lineages and you have the Luke chapter 2 Christmas. And this gets right to it, and it's kind of
the word immediately.
Right.
Is a theme.
Yeah.
And the book itself, I think, is really, you can look at it in two chunks: the first 8 chapters and the last 8 chapters, because the first 8 chapters deals with identity of Jesus. Last 8 chapters are more, what are you going to do about it?
Right.
Yeah.
You have that call of Peter right in the middle, confessing who Christ is. So you have these particular stories. In general, when you look at the Gospels, I think a lot of times people approach the Gospels erroneously, thinking it's sort of a kind of a biography of the life of Jesus, and you're amiss when you start to realize there's only a couple stories of Jesus before he's starting his public ministry. You got like a temple story and his coming of age years, and then you got his birth. But apart from that, you don't really have anything.
Yeah, it's just like primarily just 3 years of his life.
Yeah, and I think the purpose of that is it's intentional, right? Like John ends by telling you there's not enough books that could record all the things that Jesus did. So it lets you know the reason the gospel authors picked the stories they picked wasn't because those are the only stories they knew about Jesus. They were intentional stories to drive to a point. And as you go through these stories unfolding, you can look at the joy of just what's happening in the story and how Jesus is transforming lives, and it's identifying who he is. But there's a greater narrative they're telling in these stories as they tie together into a broader picture of his messianic identity.
Yeah. And in Mark chapter 1, we saw Jesus preaching in the synagogue, and all the people were marveling that he was preaching with authority. He knew not only what he was talking about, but he was not only the message giver, but he was the one who was sending the message. He was speaking as if these were his own words, because they were. He knew the law because he wrote the law. And in this bit we're going to be looking at, we see Jesus has authority over traditions and over the law itself, the law, particularly that of the Sabbath. So let's just jump into this. So let's just read it. We're going to be reading Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 18. John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and they came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "While the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the bridegroom cannot fast, can they? So long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and they will fast in that day. No one sews a patch of unshrunken cloth on an old garment. Otherwise the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and the worse tear results. No one puts new wine in old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins." So, Pastor Nathaniel, what is all this?
I got to tell you, I'm going to tell you what it is, but I'm very interested in how some of you guys might read through the idea of this new wine and wineskin. But Jesus is starting to paint a picture of the identity, which is prophetic fulfillment, really, and what he's talking about related to the thought of bridegroom. And I love that he dealing with fasting in this, tying that picture in all the way to talking about new wineskins, which I think is dealing with new covenant versus old covenant, and this new thing that Jesus is going to bring in, which is related to the idea of bridegroom. And when you go back and look in, for example, the book of Hosea, chapter 2, the idea of bridegroom is introduced there, where God's going to do something new and bring Israel in. It's likened to Jeremiah 31 in the thought of new covenant, where God's going to bring a new life. Israel's heart's going to be transformed into Him, and He uses the idea of a covenant relationship through bridegroom in drawing Israel to Him and making all things new in relationship to Him. And we know He fulfills that in the new covenant. And He relates this to the idea of fasting, which I find fascinating that they're having this dialogue. I mean, when you think of when God created Adam and Eve from the very beginning, when they had what some theologians refer to as untested creature holiness in the Garden of Eden, we were always designed with a dependency on God. Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, before sin had the curse of sin entered the world, they had to eat. We were dependent on God to supply. They had to eat, and it's this reminder, even in a state of somewhat perfection, they still had not necessarily been obedient to follow after the Lord here, but they were always dependent on the Lord to supply, and the need for God to give provision and sustenance for their life. Meaning, from the very beginning, Adam and Eve ate. That wasn't a part of the curse of the sin. That was before the curse of sin. We were relied upon God to give us what we need to nourish our body and fulfill our lives and our soul and physically and all that came along with that. And here in this passage, the idea of fasting has been a practice that's been around, I would say, from the beginning, and it's to remind us when we engage in fasting that we were made with this need for God to fulfill and satisfy. And so when we come to this place of fasting, it's to remind the soul of how much we need the Lord and to fulfill every aspect of our lives. And here he's being criticized for not fasting, and it's being pictured as this more spiritual thing. But Jesus is really using the idea of fasting and turning it to say, look, God is supplying right now, and you need to fill your soul on this. And this is where I am coming to your life. And these are the things I'm going to fulfill. And he paints that picture of the bridegroom, and which goes back to the idea of the book of Hosea, that this one would come who would bring this covenant for Israel, and this covenant would be new. And when you think of terms of covenant, for Israel in this moment, they're living in what they think is the new covenant. At that point, it hasn't become the old covenant. It is the covenant, right? And in order to end a covenant, you've got to do one of two things. You either have to satisfy its demands, or you have to die. I mean, those are the two options, right? Yeah. Like, die or satisfy. And Jesus is going to do both, right? He's going to die in the old covenant, the curse of the old covenant, and he's going to fulfill the old covenant. He's the only one faithful to do that. And through that, then he's going to usher in this new covenant. And that's what you find in this last portion. They're talking about this old wineskin, new wineskin picture. And Jesus is saying what he's about to do, he's not going to put new wine in the old wineskin. It's going to burst it. But rather, he's going to fulfill what the old covenant is, to usher in this new covenant, this new way for us to live. And he's inviting Israel in to hear that. I mean, that's the whole picture of this fasting, is saying, look, there is a time in our life where we recognize our dependency on God, but that's not where you are. That's not the season you're in right now. Fill your life with who I am, and so God is inviting Israel into that.
Yeah, you used a word a lot that we don't tend to use in our everyday life, and that word is covenant, and it's kind of like an old-timey word. What does that mean? What is a covenant?
Well, I think the first picture you get was at Genesis with Abraham. Is it Genesis 15? I think it is. Am I getting that right? It's either 15.
Somewhere in there.
Well, he gives the promise. He gives the promise of a covenant in 12.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. But then he has Abraham cutting a covenant. That's where the term comes from, where Abraham is told to sacrifice these animals, divide them in two, and before Abraham can walk through this agreement with God, he has Abraham fall asleep, and God walks through it with him, and he establishes this covenant with Abraham, which is a promise fulfillment. We tend to think in our culture contractually where we obligate one another to do things, right? If you don't bring your service to me, then I'm not obligated to fill my contract to you. But a covenant is the complete giving of who you are for the benefit of someone else, regardless of the other person. So this covenant is the idea of laying down your life for the benefit of a relationship to someone else. And the beauty of Abraham's relationship or covenantal relationship with God is that Abraham doesn't enter into that agreement with God. God completely does it on his own authority, his own character, nature, identity. He walks through it and promises Abraham. So this idea of cutting a covenant is giving of your life to the benefit of someone else. And so different than a contract. The best comparison we have today is really marriage.
Right.
Marriage is a covenant agreement between two people giving their lives for another for the benefit of them.
Yeah, just that whole till death do us part thing, it's like for better or for worse.
Laying
So
down your
you
whole life.
are entering into, it's not, and I think the big danger in modern culture is to view marriage as a contract. Of, if you don't fulfill these requirements, then our contract will be broken and we'll go our separate ways. But it was meant to be a lifelong covenant between a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, and so that is the picture that Jesus is using here.
In counseling, there's actually you'll say these people have a contract marriage instead of a covenant marriage, because a lot of times when they're bickering back and forth and scorekeeping and they're basically pleading their case, because a lot of times when they'll sit down with you, everyone's pleading their case on why they're right, and that's okay. But like it's kind of like that's the symptom of that's a contract marriage. A covenant marriage is not 50-50. A covenant marriage is 100-100.
Yep.
And therefore, it's not about what you're going to get out of it. It's how can I serve that other person?
Yeah, I think we see that played out in the attributes of God. Many of his attributes, but we'd be more familiar with the idea of God's love in 1 John 4. God is love, and it's to remind us God doesn't love you because of what you do. God loves you because of who He is, and that is His nature is willing to give itself away for your benefit. And that's what you see in the gospel. It's this invitation to come to know Christ as God has fully surrendered himself to you, giving you the opportunity to say, if God's willing to die for me, will I give my life for him? Right. Like in response back. So
let's hover there for a minute, because what you said is completely countercultural. It's completely against all our philosophy, everything that we've ever been told about what love is. We hear about it being like a two-way street. We hear about it being, it's like you got to love yourself and all these different like conflicting ideas about what love is. But what is love in the truest sense when we say God is love? How do we see God's love for us? Like what does that look like?
Well, I think in the Old Testament, for example, if you read through the Psalms, one of the emphasis is steadfast love, which is another way of saying covenantal promise fulfilling love, right? So God has obligated himself to fulfill his covenantal love based on the promises that he's given. So when we talk about love in the New Testament, obviously we use the word agape, right? Unconditional, sacrificial love. In a very practical way, we say, God's not going to love you any more than he does right now, and he's not going to love you any less based on what you've done, because his love is determined not by what you do, but who he is, the core of who he is. So it's not this, going back to the idea of contract, you do something and you have to obligate God to love you. That's not biblical love. God is already love. You're not going to make him something more than he is, or make him something less than he is. He is who he is. At the very beginning, I think we talked about this a little bit, that we tend to elevate ourselves too much and not God enough. Like you'll hear people sulk, and it's really a low-lying pride sometimes in people where they'll say, I could get over this if I could just learn to love myself more. And the truth is, the problem might be that you love yourself too much, and you think the answer's in you. It's not in you. It's in him. You don't need to look deeper within you. You need to look outside of you. To one who is for you greater than you, and who loves you where you're at, and is going to love you in this to transform your life. It's the answer for what we need is not within us as human beings. And so learning about that covenantal love, I think helps us learn to get rid of the guilt and shame that we struggle with, that we think we've got to muster up in ourselves to transform our lives, to discover a God who gives us worth and meaning and purpose be outside of us. It's not based on what we've done, which is why the story of redemption in the gospel is so important. It's not about us mustering our strength to make our life different or trying to do enough good to cover up the bad so people forget the bad. It's looking to a God who makes us altogether different. He takes us from our sin and our death and brings life in that, regardless of what we've done or not done. It's based on who he is.
It's interesting how when we see God does transform lives. He changes people. People start a discipleship path, and you do see them become more Christ-like in their actions, and there's things that diminish in their life that were harmful, but that's not the point. The point is not at those external things, and we tend to put all of the emphasis on the external things. It's really our devotion and our the covenant that we enter into with God that is the transformative power. And again, it's not about the proofs of that or the external evidences of that. It's more which we need to get stuck on as humans.
I think the obsession becomes in us. Sometimes when we mess up,
Right.
our goal becomes not messing up again.
Right.
Or you can live a good life and never walk with God.
Right.
I mean, there are plenty of moral people right in life and have no relationship with God. But I would argue for us, if you just focus on Jesus,
right,
that's going to be the result anyway.
That's right.
So don't even make your life about not doing bad or doing good. Make your life about honoring Christ as Christ has died for you. Now live for him,
right,
live to know him, and then the result will be fruit. You're not in charge of the fruit.
That's right.
God takes care of the fruit.
Yeah. We get so focused on the fruit that we lose sight of what the real problem is.
Yeah.
The real problem is we are sinners in defiance of the creator of the universe. This is a cosmological event. This
Right.
is so massive, so beyond just doing good things or being a bad person or being a good person. This is this is rebellion against the God of the universe. This is something that is so much more than, oh, did I do good things today, or was I mean to people?
Yeah.
Those are side effects of just our allegiance.
Yeah.
So what is this new covenant, and how can we enter into this new covenant?
I think it's great you started with the idea of not focusing on the fruit, because Galatians 5 talks about fruit of the Spirit. It's the Spirit's
Right.
fruit, not
That's
our
right.
fruit anyway.
That's right.
So we can make it look like
Right.
Spirit fruit when it's just by our self-made effort, but what sustains is the Spirit's fruit, not ours. I find so many people struggle with. They look at their life, struggle. They read, maybe even Christians will read the fruit of the Spirit and say, here are all these fruits. What is it, 9 fruits? And then they'll feel bad because they're good at 4 of them and bad at 5 of them. So they'll try to be
Yeah.
better at the 5. And it's like, well, that's not the point. The point is when we realize we're messing up one of the fruit, it's not that you need to improve in one fruit. It's that you need to die to self, because the
Right.
Spirit's what manifests all those fruits. And the way that we die to self is the same way we become a Christian entering into the new covenant, right? So I think the answer to the Christian life is what starts your journey with Jesus is what continues your journey with Jesus. So,
Right.
so you wake up every day and refresh yourself in the gospel, because that's where your identity is found. So when you think, or new covenant, refresh yourself in the new covenant. And it's the idea of embracing the new covenant is understanding what Jesus has done for you. It's not about what you do for him, but it's about what's been done, right? And so it's this understanding of when going back to Abraham, when Abraham entered in the covenant with God, Abraham made a sacrifice and God walked through it, right? And in the new covenant, it's the same thing, right? God makes the sacrifice, and he's the one that walks through it for
Right.
us. And we embrace the finished work of Christ. That's why when Jesus hung on the cross, John 19:30, he said, "It is finished," which is paid in full. The price of your life has been paid. God has given that covenant for us. In Jesus, in John, the final hours that he spent with his disciples in the upper room, the way he introduces his dialogue with his disciples in that final night is the idea of covenant. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you, behold, I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you may be also. And Jesus is painting that covenantal picture, showing what he's about to do with his life is establishing that covenant. It's that picture of first century. When a young man wanted to marry a young woman, he would go to the father of the bride, and they would come to an agreement on a dowry he was to pay. He would enter into a covenant with his bride. They would partake of really communion together, and then the groom would go away and prepare a house for his bride. And Jesus is doing the same thing for us. The dowry that's been agreed upon for our life was his life. He gave his life to pay for our lives. And Jesus then in John goes to prepare a place for us, that covenantal picture where Jesus is going to give his life for us. And so in the Old Testament, the sacrifice of animals in the Old Testament was this picture of foreshadowing of Jesus, who would be that ultimate lamb, that ultimate sacrifice for us. So we place our faith, our trust in that finished work of Christ, of what he's done on the cross. We know we're sinful. We know we owe God, or we should know that we owe God a payment for our sin, but we recognize Jesus has made that payment for us. And so we ask for that account of Christ to be attributed to us, that we get forgiveness for our sin because of what he's done.
So the payment has been paid. Christ paid it in full. But there are a lot of people who add things onto that. They say, well, what about baptism? Well, what about tithing? What about fasting? And that is what Jesus is talking about here is fasting. Where does all that come into play? Do we need to live righteous, holy lives in order to receive, like, is this part of our
Mike was knocking on this door a minute ago with some of the things. You want to field that, Mike?
No.
But where does all this come in?
Well, again, it's we were talking about we became interested in the metrics. Mm-hmm. And we want to produce, and that's who we are as Americans. We're achievers. We want to earn it. We're self-made people, and it's hard sometimes for us to wrap our brain around that this is not about us. Mm-hmm. That it is God, Christ working in us. Like, for example, I love your point on the fruit. The fruit is amazing, but who did that? It's the fruit of the Spirit, and I think that's where we get in this desire to please, or to probably frankly please ourselves, and look how many fruit I've got. Look, let me show you the evidences of this. And I think that when you just, like you said, when you just focus on Christ, He produces that. Mm. And so, Tom, it's so funny. As you said that, I thought to myself, how many times have I maybe messed up someone's Christian life by pointing out the progress they've made because now they're thinking about it.
Right.
They're probably were just blissfully unaware God's just working in their life, and they are taking on more of a Christ character because of their devotion to Christ. And now I've complimented. Now they're going to focus on doing those things. Yeah. And it's funny how the metrics are just upside down.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say that Galatians chapter 2 kind of puts that idea plainly for us that, good works have a place, right? Mm-hmm. But they're not a place of proving something. They're a place of worship.
Right.
What I do physically is an outflow of what's happened to me inwardly, right? My transformed life. And so, if I understand who Jesus really is, and I love him, like if I've seen the love that he has for me, what he's done for me, anytime anyone does something that kind, generous, gracious, or no one's done something that kind or generous, gracious for us, but anytime someone does do something kind, generous, gracious to you, our immediate reaction as people is, how can I show my thankfulness? Like, what can I do to show my appreciation? And the Bible tells us, outdo one another in showing honor, right? Because we have this desire to want to honor things that are honorable, and not always with the right intentions, but we do. We have this desire. And I would say the same thing with Christ. Once you learn what God has done for you, the natural outflow of our life would be, well, what can I do in response, right? And so our good work should be that. It should be a place of showing our loyalty to Jesus and understanding how our life has been transformed with new purpose and meaning, invited into his kingdom, his glory, to live that out. And so now that you belong to something different, you would want to emulate that. You would want to honor that. You would want to cherish it. So our spiritual gifts become a great way to do that. Anything that we do kindly or generously just is a display of what God has done for us inwardly. So some people religiously would approach that from the opposite angle, right? They would want to say, okay, I want to make God have to owe me something. So how can I manipulate this situation where God is in my back pocket rather than me living for his glory. And so they use works from the opposite angle of trying to make God indebted to you, rather than us really feeling indebted to him because of his love.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes when we talk about legalism, it's like some people want a journey to God, but what you want is a journey with God.
Yeah.
And I think that the journey to God, you never get there. There's just, the chasm's too wide. There's just, you're incapable. You need God. And I think, but that's that kind of rugged individual.
And it's prideful. I mean, you think what it builds, right?
Yeah.
It's like you think your successes are you,
right?
But the bad part of that is if you're gonna win your successes, you've also got to wear your failures, right? If you and then that person in that guilt and shame when they blow it, like where do you go? Because you have nowhere else other than you. You think you are your gospel, right. And that is not freeing. That's a prison to live in.
Yeah, it reminds me of the older son in the parable of the prodigal son, because when the younger brother comes back after squandering his father's wealth, the father shows the younger son so much this abundance of grace and mercy, and he pours out his love on this younger son. And the older son comes in from working hard in the field for his father, and he sees all this, and he's indignant, and he says, this is, the father comes out, and the older son says, look, all my life I have worked for you. I've given everything. I've worked so hard, and you've never given me even just a small goat to celebrate with my friends, to have just a little barbecue. Yeah. And the father says, my son, everything I have is yours. Yeah. You're working for something that I've already given you freely.
Yeah, Luke 15.
Yeah,
we've mistitled that parable with I think Tim Keller talks about it's the prodigal God, not the prodigal son. Yeah. We tend to focus on the prodigal son and it completely misses the other son whose attitude is religious rather than transformed in the gospel. And that's really where a lot of us find ourselves, right? We hang our hat on our goodness rather than Christ's goodness.
Yeah. Would you say that's kind of what the Pharisees are complaining about?
Well, they have certainly found their identity in the law, haven't they?
Yeah.
And not even God's law, but rather the law that they have added on top of God's law. So, yeah, and their boasting becomes in that, and they're completely missing what Christ is saying. They think that their identity is found in what they do for God. Like you talked about this a minute ago, where you think the enormity of Creator God, but that's great. And then the incredible part of the gospel is while he is transcendent, he's also come imminent. He's come near,
right.
And they're going to miss it. They think that they're worshiping this great God, and he's right in front of them, and he's telling them, "Look, you don't need to be fasting right now. Yeah. You let your life be filled up on the richness of who I am, because the days are coming where fasting, will have a place, or it can have a place." But right now, you need to pay attention to what's in front of you and let your life be enriched in this.
Yeah, and that really is the beauty of the gospel, is that this infinite holy God takes on flesh and becomes a human to pay that price for us. And so if we miss either side of Christ's deity or Christ's humanity, we really lose the beauty of the gospel.
Right. And I never quoted the Galatians verse a minute ago, but it tells us if righteousness could be achieved through the law, then Christ died needlessly in Galatians 2:19. And so I think if we could walk away from this section thinking, not that I need to leave it right now, but if we think in our mind, I need to think less of what I've done and more of what Christ has done for me, and put my eyes on that, the things of this world pass away, right? Like my purpose of my life is fulfilled, not in me focusing on just simply doing good or being a good person. My purpose in life is fulfilled when I give my life to Christ and just live for his glory, right? Put my eyes on Jesus, and God produces that fruit in me.
Okay. Well, let's keep going in this passage, because we're supposed to get through the end of the chapter. So picking back up in verse 23 of Mark chapter 2. And it happened that he, being Jesus, was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need, and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with him." Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So, Pastor Nathaniel, what's going on here?
I think, again, they have created some extra laws in front of their laws to complicate things, but talking about the Jewish people in this passage. But I think Jesus is getting to a bigger picture at the end to remind us of the greatness of who he is. I mean, this again, goes all the way back to our creation. The idea of fasting did that in the first section. The idea of Sabbath does it in this section. When you think of the first two chapters of the Bible, when God creates each day, and he tells us after each day it's morning and evening of the first day, morning and evening of the second day, calls everything good. It's not until he creates mankind that he says everything is very good. And then on the seventh day, it tells us that he rests. And one of the interesting things in Genesis is that when God tells us he rests, there's a uniqueness to the seventh day that's not found in any other of the other days. All the other days, you find morning and evening, morning and evening, morning and evening, and then the next day comes. But the seventh day, there's never a morning and evening. It's just you enter into that Sabbath, and that's it. And it's a picture of who God is to be for us. He is that place of rest, that place where we find our identity in him, purpose in him, and just resting in relationship with him. And I think as Israel went on to celebrate a particular day as Sabbath, it was intended to be an ultimate picture of who the Lord would be for us, right? As we're redeemed or restored in him, that we would find ourselves in that Sabbath rest. And he's reminding them, they've gotten to this place where, again, religiously, they think it's all about what they're doing. And the Sabbath is becoming something they have to wear rather than something that they have to rest in. It's become this burden. And the purpose of that was never intended to be that way, but to recognize what God would ultimately become in them again. And so the Lord is reminding that of them, I think, at the end, the idea of what Sabbath is truly to be. I mean, I would say even for me, I mean, Jesus tells us in Matthew, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I will be your rest," which is an idea of Sabbath, right? That it's, for us in this new covenant, it's not about a day of the week anymore, though I do think it's important for God's people to gather on a day to worship.
Right.
But ultimately that God be your rest. Mm-hmm. That you don't, it's not about your work, it's about his work, right? So that's why we have this place of peace and rest in God, because we can be confident that what Jesus has done is more than enough. And so we have this place of rest. But he's warning them right now of the way that they're treating the Sabbath, and I think he ends it with reminding them of their identity, his identity, mm-hmm. which is the Son of Man.
Yeah.
So he transitions from, here's what the Sabbath is really supposed to be, and the best way to get to that is my identity. And so he comes this idea of Son of Man. And Son of Man is not, it's a picture of Old Testament is rich in the idea of what the Son of Man represents. And depending on what part of the Old Testament you're looking at, I think the idea of Son of Man evolves throughout the Old Testament, even into Jewish writings in Jesus's day. But if I give you just a few examples, Ezekiel 34 deals with the idea of Son of Man. Ezekiel takes the title Son of Man throughout the book of Ezekiel. But when you get to Ezekiel 34, you see that Ezekiel starts off with this title, Son of Man, but throughout that chapter, God starts talking about what's wrong with leadership in Israel and how they are taking advantage of the sheep. They're abusing the sheep. And by the time you get to the end of the chapter, God describes himself as a sheep and as really that identity of the Son of Man. And he starts to share with us how he's going to put one on the throne of David. He actually just talks about David as if David's still alive. But the picture is one through the lineage of David who's going to rule as a king and care for the sheep. And so you start to get this messianic identity of the Son of Man who's going to be a ruler who cares for the sheep of Israel. And he talks about creating within them a new heart. So he plays on this idea of Son of Man. And then you come to a book like Daniel, and Daniel talks about the Son of Man again in chapter 7, but he personifies the Son of Man as deity coming on the clouds, right? Coming with the Almighty, but he also attributes design of deity or descriptions of deity that's only used for God. And so this idea of Son of Man is very rich in the Old Testament. I mean, the very root of Son of Man deals with physical man, right? So the Son of Man picture is one that is human, ruling on the throne of David, but also represents deity in the book of Daniel. And this Jesus is giving them this holistic picture of who he is, so they see really the fulfillment of the gospel and this identity that God would pursue us, God would give his life for us, one from the seed of Adam and Eve from Genesis 2 that would ultimately, or Genesis 3, that would ultimately come give his life for us. So as they're thinking about Sabbath, he, I think, is pulling the picture ultimately to himself. That would be the fulfillment of what we need to find true Sabbath in the Lord.
Right. And they were looking at Sabbath very legalistically, very religiously, where even as they were just walking along, the disciples were just kind of picking heads of grain as they were walking through this field and just kind of rubbing it between their hands and just like eating the bits of grain. So it's like that's not work in like really, but they were. The Pharisees were looking at that and it's like, yeah, but they're picking heads of grain. They are working on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Well, and when you look at this in comparison, like yesterday, we're talking about Jesus eating with sinners and hanging out with Levi, and you have these are the who's who religious of the day, and they feel slighted. So their whole approach to this is, aha,
I got you,
and so that's really so it even begins at the heart of the question. Like, why was it? What was this even about?
That's good.
Yeah,
I mean, and that's how Jesus concludes with the Son of Man. Is right. He's over the Sabbath, right? Mm-hmm. So he has the authority to do whatever he wants.
Yes, but I mean, the Pharisees are essentially saying we are more religious than you. We are more righteous than you, and they're saying this to God Himself. And Jesus just says, I am Lord of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
These are my rules.
Yeah.
This was something I set up, not as a thing that makes you more righteous, but I set this up for you.
Right.
I made Sabbath for you as a time of rest.
Yeah. And I think that's Jesus is building this, right? Like you have the wrong picture of Sabbath, which we still have today, right?
Yeah.
People tend to think God. Sometimes I think people think God only listens on Sunday, right? So let's just do my good stuff in this day, so I can do whatever I want the rest of the day. And so we sort of emphasize one day over another. But that's really not been God's design. It's Sabbath is just a reminder of something bigger, right? It's a picture of ultimate rest in Him, which we have achieved in Jesus. But Jesus is telling them here in the beginning. First of all, you've got the wrong picture of Sabbath. So let's take about a 10,000 foot view rather than get in the weeds on this. They're so focused on the detail of living a law to boast in themselves that they're forgetting the whole point of the Sabbath is not even about yourself. It's about boasting in Christ or resting in the Lord. And so, and that's where He tells us the Sabbath was you weren't made to serve the Sabbath, but rather the Sabbath was made to serve you, right? To draw near to God. And by the way, I'm Lord of it, so I think I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, you've mentioned several times finding rest in Christ, and for so many of us, that's a very foreign concept. There is nothing restful about faith. There's nothing restful about religion. It's a lot of rules. It's a lot of just all the things that are required of me. It's just heaping on more things for me to do. Mm-hmm. How can we find rest in Christ?
Well, let me give you a practical thought. Yeah, even right now, if anyone's listening to this, there are probably some burden struggles, some things we've got to fulfill in life. We're just feeling the stress. I would just encourage you to think about the fact, rather than all the things you need to do for a minute, just to think about the Lord and where you are in position with Him, and to recognize God knows exactly where you are, and God knows exactly what you need, and nothing that you're going through is a surprise to Him, and He is completely sufficient. In fact, I would just press a little further. What is it that you think you're going to do that God can't do for Himself, right? Like, we sometimes, in a religious sense, we think that we create a picture of a God that's inadequate in some way, like God needs me for something, as if God lacks, right? And when you realize how great God is, and there's nothing that God has where He is lacking in. In fact, if your picture of God is lacking in any way at all, I would tell you, abandon that God immediately, because it's not really God. If God can't fulfill His promises and who He is in any way, then there's you trusting in Him at some point is going to not. It could not end well, right? Like, but if God is completely sufficient in who He is, and doesn't need you for anything, but rather instead He desires and wants you, like relationally, it's a very freeing thing to think of the greatness of who God is in that capacity, and at the same time that God would pursue us and give His life for us. He's not an inadequate God. He's not a lacking God. He doesn't need me, but yet He still wants me, and He's given His life for me. Now, there's nothing that I'm going to do that God can't do for Himself. Mm-hmm. But yet He still pursued me and gave everything for me. So it puts me in a different place of mind in how I respond to Him when I understand God in that way, right? And it's from that position where I then get this great picture of who God is, that I can respond really in a way that's been set free because of what Christ has done. And all that I do at that point comes to this place of joy and freedom and grace, and and not pressure, and wondering if I'm going to live up to expectations, and what's wrong with me, and why can I, it's a different position in a God that is that way rather than one that lacks.
Yeah. Our good works, it's like visiting Dad in his workshop as like a little bugger, maybe you're like 5 years old. You're going and you're visiting Dad, and he's hard at work. And you just kind of look over at what he's doing, and he's like, "Come here, help me with this." And we're you're helping him like lift this tire, like put that on the car, and you're struggling, and you're helping him, right? And not in your mind, you don't realize, one, he doesn't need your help. Two, you're not actually like doing anything. Yeah. You're in the act, you're helping, but it's entirely for your benefit that you're helping. Yeah. He doesn't need your help. And you're helping him put it on, and he's like showing you, this is how you use the put the lug nuts on. This is what you do. This is how you do it. But he's showing you for your benefit. You are helping him, and you are together. There is this fellowship. There is something that you are doing together, and we tend to view it as, oh, I need to. It's like, oh, there was, Saturday he was in the shop and I wasn't there to help him. Oh no. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, it doesn't matter.
That's a miserable place to be as a Christian. You think you're showing up because you feel like you're obligated or guilted. It's not driven by a relationship that's freed you, and then church or whatever you participate in religiously just becomes this burden of joyless.
But at the heart of it, God wants you. He wants to be with you, and He wants the good works are for our benefit. It's for our edification. It's for our growth. It isn't out of service to God. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is, but at the same time, there's something greater that's happening there, and that is God working in and through us. So it's for our benefit, and it's for the benefit of those around us, but it isn't for God's benefit.
I'd say that the probably cliche passage for all that's Ephesians 2:8-10, right? For by grace you're saved through faith. It's a gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. And then verse 10, you're created in Christ Jesus for good works, right?
Right.
I think the natural outflow of a life that's been transformed by God is a beautiful work that we get to display to the world. It's a privilege to be able to do that, not an obligation. That you have the opportunity to even respond and share a love for God because of his love for you. It's when you can get to that place from privilege instead of a place of obligation. I think that's where you start to, someone truly understands what the gospel is, right? I don't think that that's the case for most people. I think most people in this world operate from a place of obligation because they have a religious perspective, rather than a place of recognizing truly what God's done, and then in that freely being able to respond with the beautiful work that God has done in you on display for others to see through you.
Okay, so let's say someone is listening and they say, I don't find rest in Jesus. I recognize that this is wrong, that I shouldn't feel this way, but I do. How do I get to that place where I can find rest in Christ?
Well, not having the person here, I would just say we need to get to a place of motive. What's driving why they're doing, and how do they see the finished work of Christ in their life? Like, do they think that they're attributing something to this, or are they really looking at themselves too much and not enough at what Jesus has done? I mean, just those words, John 19:30, it is finished. If you let those words echo in your mind, what is he talking about? Well, he is on the cross talking about your life, the payment for your life to know him and to walk with him for all of eternity. What was necessary is done. It's not about what you're doing, it's about what he's done. If you can take the pressure off of what you're doing and look at what he's done, I think you find freedom in those words and a place of rest in Christ. Now, you may get up and do good things, and I hope that you do, but I hope the motive for that is not about trying to merit anything from God, because there's nothing you're going to do to impress him. He wants you to be impressed with who he is, not you to impress him with who you are.
That's right.
And I think that's the beauty of the Christian life, is that place of rest. Christians, some people I think hear what Christians say in the gospel and think, well, what stops you from living like hell, right? Like, what to emulating that in your life? And the response is the love of God. Let your life be enriched in the love of God. Why would you respond in a negative, bad, awful way when you know how much he's loved you and how much he's trained your life and given you a new identity to live for a new purpose? Why would you want to go back to that old life? Why would you want sin to master over you when Christ is your new master? It doesn't make sense when you've been loved that way that you would respond so ill-willed. No, that's not a normal human tendency. When someone loves you deeply, you respond in love towards them. You could never pay them back for what they've done when they've sacrificed to give to you, but you do want to show your thankfulness in that. And it's the same thing with Jesus. It's not this obligation. It's this place of joy of just wanting to respond.
Yeah. A life in Christ is so much better than a life in sin, and the true joy that comes from a heart that is being transformed by God is better than any temporary thing that we might try to satisfy that desire, in that life. But yeah. So I think it's been a good conversation. I feel like I've learned something.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's been good. Real quick, Alpine Bible Church. Yes. Where do you meet? When? How would someone connect with you?
You go to alpinebible.com is our website. We're in Lehigh, 310 East State Street, and we have 2 services, one at 9:30 and again at 11, and then ministries throughout the week for all ages.
Awesome. Mike, you have a program on Key Radio.
8 p.m. on Sunday, Lose Yourself, and you also find me at loseyourself.life.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate both of you coming in. It's been a great time. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a great conversation.
And thank you, Grant. Thanks for your excellent work.
Yeah.
Round of applause.
It's been good. We should. I'll be here next week. These guys won't, and it'll be a good time. So thanks for listening.
With SRN News, I'm John Scott. Phoenix is America's hottest big metro, with temperatures soaring over 100 degrees Fahrenheit every day this month.